Imagine this. A young colonial power standing on the edge of the world it knows, staring into a horizon so cold and endless it feels like the edge of creation itself. A nation clawing its way across continents, driven by fire, faith, and greed. We've all heard about America's westward push. Manifest destiny, cowboys, railroads, and the horror that followed. But across the frozen Bering Sea, another empire was doing the same damn thing. Only colder, only darker, only lonelier. This is the story of how Russia conquered Siberia, a conquest that turned a wilderness of ice and silence into the largest empire on Earth. Siberia. Even the name feels heavy. 13 million square kilometers of taiga, mountains, and frozen swamps. A land that eats people alive. It's the roof of Asia. 77% of Russia's total landmass, nearly a fifth of the planet's surface. It's colder than hell if hell ever froze over. Temperatures drop low enough to crack metal. Winters last forever. And yet, people lived there. Dozens of nations, dozens of languages, hunters, reindeer herders, shamans. People who understood the rhythm of the land and the spirits that haunted it. They lived with the cold, not against it. Their world was brutal and beautiful, until outsiders came looking for something soft fur. Not gold, not silver, fur, thick, shining sable and fox. In Europe and Asia, fur was luxury, it was survival, it was status. That hunger for pelts pulled traders and killers alike toward the ice. Long before there even was a Russia, the merchants of medieval Novgorod were already drifting east, searching for animal skins worth more than their weight in silver. They called the strange world beyond the Ural Mountains, the land of Yugur, a vague word for the tribes out there in the snow. They came with spears and chainmail and arrogance, demanding tribute from people who owed them nothing. And sometimes the locals fought back and won. Those early raids ended in blood and frost, their bodies frozen stiff on the tundra. For centuries, Siberia stayed a rumor, half myth, half nightmare, until a new power rose from the west. By the late 1400s, Moscow was rising. The Grand Duchy had thrown off Mongol rule, swallowed up Novgorod, and crowned a new ruler, Ivan IV. You know him better as Ivan the Terrible. He earned that title the hard way. He built an empire out of fear and slaughter. His armies crushed the Muslim khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, opening the gate to the Urals, and everything beyond them. But waiting on the other side was another empire, the Khanate of Siberia, the northernmost Islamic state in history. Turkic Khans tracing their blood back to Genghis Khan himself. Mosques in the snow. Traders dealing with Bukhara and Samarkand. Their ruler, Yedigar Khan, tried to play smart. He bent the knee to Moscow and sent them 1,000 sable skins a year in tribute. But politics in the steppe are like the wind, always shifting. A rival named Kuchum overthrew Yedigar and tore up the peace. Russia couldn't hit back, it was bleeding in the Livonian War. But Ivan the Terrible wasn't the kind of man to forget. If he couldn't send soldiers, he'd send merchants. He turned to the Stroganovs, a dynasty of wealthy traders who ruled their own lands like kings. He gave them the right to raise a private army and conquer in his name. The Stroganovs hired someone perfectly suited for the job, a Cossack outlaw named Yermak. Yermak was no hero. He was a bandit with a bounty on his head, but he had what the Tsar respected, nerve. In 1581, Yermak set out across the Urals with 1,600 men. Cossacks with muskets, marching into the unknown. On the other side waited warriors with bows and courage. They met at Chuvash Cape. For 3 straight days, snow and blood mixed together until the earth itself seemed to freeze red. When it was over, the Khanate of Siberia was gone, and the gates of Siberia were wide open. That one outlaw's victory lit a fuse that would burn clear across a continent, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Yermak's victory changed everything. What started as a bandit's gamble became the beginning of an empire. Word of his conquest spread like wildfire across Russia. Tales of endless land, rivers thick with fish, forests bursting with fur. It sounded like paradise. But paradise, as always, was already occupied. For the tribes of Siberia, Yermak's victory was the sound of thunder in the distance, rolling closer every year. Cossacks came like ghosts out of the forest. They built wooden forts on riverbanks, raised the Tsar's flag, and demanded tribute. They called it yasak, payment in fur. Every native family had to hand over the best sable or fox pelts they could find. If they refused, the Cossacks didn't negotiate. They burned villages. They took hostages. Sometimes they took children. The empire called it tribute. But it was conquest, pure and simple. The Russian state was broke, bleeding from wars in the West, so it paid its soldiers in furs. The more pelts they collected, the richer they became. And so, the conquest wasn't driven by generals or kings. It was driven by greed, by men in frozen armor dragging muskets through waist-deep snow, hunting both animals and people. The Cossacks built a trail of forts, one after another. Tobolsk, Tomsk, Yeniseisk, Irkutsk. Each fort was a nail hammered into the body of Siberia. The people who lived there, Evenks, Yakuts, Nenets, Chukchi, had never seen anything like these men. They called them Iron People. They came with thundersticks that spat fire. They came with crosses. They came with laws written in a language no one could read. And behind them came priests. Missionaries with frozen fingers and burning eyes, preaching about salvation to people who never asked for it. They tore down sacred idols, burned shaman drums, and baptized entire villages in icy rivers. Those who resisted were branded pagans, savages, enemies of the Tsar. Some fought back. Tribes rose up, ambushed Cossack patrols, slaughtered tax collectors. But resistance only brought more fire. Entire nations disappeared without a word written about them. No chronicles, no names, just silence, lost in the snow. The Russians called it exploration. But what they were doing was something darker. They weren't mapping the land. They were erasing the people. And the deeper they pushed, the stranger the land became. Forests turned into endless plains. Plains became permafrost. The sun itself changed color. Time moved differently. The Cossacks said the air smelled of ghosts. They believed the land itself was cursed. That's what happens when you kill too much in too short a time. But still, they kept going. Not because of courage. Not even duty. They went because behind them stood Moscow, and Moscow wanted furs. Those furs fueled the empire. They paid for wars, bought weapons, filled the Tsar's coffers. The skin of Siberian animals became the skin of Russian power. Every year, caravans left the east loaded with pelts worth more than gold. And every year the Cossacks pushed farther, across rivers with no names, through forests that swallowed armies whole. The conquest of Siberia wasn't one war. It was hundreds of small ones, raids, massacres, ambushes, all fading into the white noise of empire. Somewhere out there, Yermak himself met his end. A few years after his great victory, the natives struck back. He was ambushed near the Irtysh River, drowned in the black water under a rain of arrows. His armor dragged him down. The man who opened Siberia died in it. But his death didn't stop the machine. The Tsar called him a hero, sent more men east, and the march continued. By the early 1600s, Russia had crossed the Ob, the Yenisei, and the Lena rivers. They were halfway across the largest landmass on Earth, and they weren't slowing down. It took Europe centuries to conquer the Americas. Russia did the same thing across an entire continent in less than 75 years. What they built wasn't just an empire of land. It was an empire of silence. Millions of square miles where no one could speak without permission. Siberia became a word that meant two things at once: opportunity and exile. Because soon, the Tsars would realize something else about all that empty space. It was the perfect place to send people they didn't want to see again. By the mid-1600s, the Russian Empire had done the impossible. They had crossed a continent. From the Urals to the Pacific, they carved a frozen road through the wilderness, leaving behind forts, graves, and broken tribes. But conquest doesn't stop once the shooting ends. It mutates. It changes shape. The same wilderness that once swallowed invaders now became something else. An open-air prison for an empire built on fear. Siberia wasn't just land anymore. It was punishment. When the Tsar's enemies rose up, they were sent east. When thinkers questioned authority, when rebels shouted too loudly, when anyone dared to dream of freedom, the road to Siberia opened. For the poor, it was a grave. For the powerful, it was hell with snow. The word exile became a sentence heavier than death. Men and women chained together, walking thousands of miles through mud and ice. Some froze along the way, some vanished into the forests, and some simply lay down in the snow and stopped breathing. But the empire didn't care. Siberia was endless, and it could absorb anything. It swallowed entire generations. Farmers, soldiers, priests, poets, people who once had names and families became shadows drifting through the taiga. The government called it colonization, but what it really was disposal. And yet, out of all that despair, something strange happened. Those who survived, the exiles, the settlers, the soldiers, started building. They dug roads through permafrost, built wooden towns that clung to the edges of rivers, raised churches whose bells froze solid in the winter air. They brought with them bits of Europe, language, law, cruelty, and faith, and planted them deep in the snow. And slowly, Siberia began to change. The furs grew scarcer, the native tribes fewer. In their place rose a new kind of people, half frontier, half exile. Men and women who belonged to no one but the land itself. They learned to read the wind, to respect the cold, to live with the silence. The same silence that had once been a punishment became their freedom. But the empire never stopped watching. Behind every frontier post stood the Tsar's seal. Behind every priest, a soldier. Behind every church, a gallows. Because empire doesn't just conquer land, it conquers memory. It rewrites everything it touches. By the 1700s, Siberia was a place of contradictions. It was hell and home, a colony and a tomb, a place where you could vanish or be reborn. The Romanovs expanded the network of prisons, sending wave after wave of convicts and dissenters. Peasants who couldn't pay taxes, revolutionaries who spoke too loudly, scholars who wrote the wrong thing. All of them disappeared into the white. And still, Russia kept pushing east. They reached the Pacific. They claimed Kamchatka, the Amur, the shores of the Okhotsk Sea. They even looked across the Bering Strait and saw another frontier, Alaska. Think about that. A single empire had now stretched from Poland to California, from the Baltic to the Pacific. The sun rose and set within its borders. And it all began with a bandit named Yermak chasing furs into the snow. But for the people trapped inside that empire, especially the ones exiled to Siberia, there was no sunrise. Only cold mornings that never seemed to end. They say you can still feel it in the air there, the echoes of chains, the whispers of those who never came back. Because Siberia doesn't forget. It remembers every footstep, every scream, every broken prayer carried away by the wind. And yet, in the empire's arrogance, it believed the conquest was complete. That Siberia was finally tamed, but nature doesn't bow forever, and history has a way of thawing what empires try to freeze. Centuries passed, and the snow kept falling. The Tsars rose and fell. Empires burned and were rebuilt from the ashes. But Siberia remained. When the Romanovs died in blood and fire, the land didn't change. It simply watched. It had seen conquerors come and go. And when the red flag of revolution rose over Moscow, Siberia was waiting, silent, patient, ready to swallow another kind of empire. The Soviets took what the Tsars had built and made it worse. Under Stalin, Siberia became a machine of punishment. The Gulag system turned the frozen wilderness into a network of labor camps stretching from the Urals to the Pacific. Men and women worked themselves to death cutting timber, mining coal, building railways that led nowhere. The cold became a weapon. The snow became a wall. And once again Siberia did what it had always done. It erased people. Historians estimate that more than 18 million souls passed through the Gulag archipelago. Some returned. Most didn't. Their bones still lie beneath the permafrost, unmarked, unnamed, unremembered. But even through all that, Siberia never stopped being beautiful. It's strange how a land that has seen so much death can still look so pure. The taiga stretches forever, silent and ancient. The rivers glimmer like steel. And when the wind moves, it sounds almost human, like it's whispering the stories no one was supposed to tell. Today, when we think of Russia, we think of the Kremlin, of wars, of politics. But the real Russia, the one that shaped its soul, is Siberia. That frozen frontier forged the Russian mind: endurance, fatalism, survival. The idea that suffering isn't just part of life, it is life. From Yermak's muskets to Stalin's trains, Siberia was the stage where the empire tested its power and its cruelty. It was where human ambition met nature's indifference, and nature always wins. You can conquer a land. You can build cities. You can lay down railroads and prisons and monuments. But you can't conquer the cold. You can't conquer silence. And you can't conquer memory. Because beneath that endless snow lie stories still breathing. Stories of tribes wiped from history, rebels frozen in their chains, children born under skies so dark they never saw the sun. All of it buried beneath the myth of empire. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Russian conquest of Siberia. Not glory, not gold, not even victory. But the reminder that when nations chase destiny too far, they start to lose themselves in the snow. So the next time you see a map of Russia, stretching from one side of the earth to the other, remember what that map cost. Remember that every inch of that empire was bought with blood, fur, and silence. Because the story of Siberia isn't just about conquest. It's about humanity, what it becomes when it forgets its limits. And maybe, somewhere out there in the frozen night, the wind still carries a voice. The voice of those who came before. The voice that says, we were here, we lived, we died, and we remember.